Let's be honest, half the fun of Invincible is how often the tone and pacing changes. Remember finishing the first episode for the first time? Even though we'd been teased about Omni-Man's darker side, nobody in their right mind thought it would go that far. The creators have a knack for pulling the rug from under us. Just when we're settling into the usual superhero vibes, something unexpected happens and turns the moment on its head. What's remarkable is that this formula never gets old. By the time we reach Season 2 and now Season 3, we're practically expecting for something to go wrong. And yet, Invincible somehow manages to keep surprising us. The reason? A careful mix of pacing and tone. By now, we've seen the show go balls to the wall multiple times, whether it's Omni-Man killing the Guardians, the entire fight with Battle Beast, or when Mark and Nolan have to fight the Viltrumites on Thraxa. But it doesn't remain that way. The show selectively chooses when to slam on the gas and when to coast. In fact, the slower, quieter scenes can be just as nerve-wracking as the battles. Think about Debbie and Nolan's exchange in Season 1. The way Debbie starts piecing things together. There's no immediate threat during those conversations, but knowing what Omni-Man is capable of made that a sort of coughing baby versus nuclear bomb kind of thing. Tone, on the other hand, is the show's ability to shift seamlessly from comedy to, wow, so those are his guts. We'll have our guard down one moment, and then suddenly Amber has a hand around her neck. This works because the comedic moments never feel out of place. They're grounded in characters we genuinely like, or at least find amusing, so when the mood shifts, it's earned rather than forced. Because Invincible is fundamentally about these characters and their relationships, the showrunners give us enough space to care about them. That way, when Mark, Debbie, or Eve face their next problem, we're fully invested. It's not just cartoon violence for the sake of violence. Furthermore, what made the ending of Episode 1, Season 1 hit so hard is how carefully the show builds up to it. We spend time with Mark in high school, him trying to rizz up Amber, I guess, and going through a training montage. It all feels safe. And then it goes, fuck all that, watch Omni-Man cook these frauds. It's not just shock value, it's the moment that sets the tone for the entire show. From that point on, even the lighthearted moments like Mark figuring out how to fly or dealing with relationships are layered with a creeping sense of unease, because we know what this world is capable of. What's even more impressive is how Season 1 keeps that balance. The show never loses its heart, giving us those sweet everyday moments, but the tension is always there, humming in the background. Nolan isn't who he says he is, and disaster feels inevitable. By the time Mark and Omni-Man fight each other, the weight of what might happen is unbearable. That's pacing done right, pulling you in slowly and winning you over forever. Then Season 2 picks up the pieces. Mark is dealing with physical and emotional trauma, Debbie is trying to comprehend Nolan's betrayal, and Earth itself is reeling from the revelation that their greatest hero is actually the biggest threat. Right away, we feel the aftershocks of Season 1's cliffhanger. The show doesn't just sweep that moment under the rug for the sake of getting to the next plot point. Instead, it weaves the consequences into every episode. In terms of pacing, Season 2 shows Invincible at its most nuanced. Rather than immediately throwing Mark back into the ring, the show spends time exploring his PTSD and guilt. But that's not to say Season 2 skims on action. In fact, the battles that do happen, whether it's Mark teaming up with Titan or fighting whoever, are even more intense because they're loaded with emotional baggage. The comedy is still there too, and they don't undermine the drama, they highlight it. Every comedic moment feels like a break before Mark gets his ass kicked again. One strength of Invincible is how it balances its main story with subplots. Whether it's Eve trying to mend things with her parents or the GDA scrambling to fill the power vacuum left by Omni-Man, they don't just exist for filler, they enhance the overall narrative. Remember when we first saw Eve strike out on her own? That subplot could have just gone nowhere, yet it becomes a vital part of understanding the difference between being a superhero and doing actual good. Eve realizes she can accomplish more by using her powers practically, like creating sustainable ecosystems, than by just punching criminals. Her scenes tend to be calmer, more introspective, and that feels refreshing when placed alongside the Graysons' emotional spiral. Season 2 builds on this by interweaving these smaller arcs into the main storyline at just the right moments, making sure we never linger too long on one plotline. Instead of feeling scattered, it feels like we're getting a better view of a world reeling from Omni-Man's betrayal. That sort of narrative architecture keeps the pacing brisk and dynamic. Season 3 only keeps that up. Take episode 4 for example. 1 minute, Mark is on a date with Eve, and the next, he's traveling dimensions to fight an evil immortal. That constant back and forth between high-stakes action and quiet emotional moments is what makes the show so gripping. And it's not just the pacing. Season 3 cranks up the emotional stakes too. Look at episode 3. Mark and Oliver are just shooting the shit, talking about superhero costumes, joking around like brothers do, and then I just hit my mic. They're thrown into a brutal fight with the Mahler twins, and everything spirals out of control. That's Invincible at its best. One moment you're laughing, the next you're bracing yourself for whatever's gonna come next. And that's actually an underrated part of Invincible. How it flips between everyday conversations and absolute carnage without skipping a beat. And it works so well for 2 reasons. First, it keeps us on edge. No matter how normal a scene starts, we know danger is never too far away. Just because a moment feels safe doesn't mean it is. Second, it reinforces just how brutal this world can be. Even though it's animated, Invincible never lets us forget the weight of its violence. The show doesn't just use humor to lighten the mood, it uses those lighter moments to remind us how quickly everything can fall apart. And honestly, that's what makes it so dope. We've come to expect the gut punches. A casual dinner conversation between the Guardians can instantly turn into an all-out massacre. And yeah, sometimes it's so abrupt that it's almost morbidly funny, right up until you realize that someone might not make it out alive this time. Every joke, every lighthearted moment feels like a setup for the next tragedy, and that's why it never feels forced or out of place. Invincible knows exactly how to play with our emotions, and to be fair, I wouldn't have it any other way. That being said, I can't talk about Invincible right now without mentioning the animation. Some people lose their minds over it, but honestly, I don't give that much of a shit. Sure, there are moments where the movement feels stiff or a fight doesn't flow as smoothly as it could, and yeah, I get why that bothers some people. But here's the thing. The animation still does a lot right. It makes up for its rougher moments with smart visual choices. The shading, the dynamic camera angles, the way the world reacts to every punch, you feel it. When someone gets sent flying, the debris, the glass shattering, the sheer force of it all makes sure it lands. A lot of animated shows don't bother with those details, but Invincible does, and it helps ground the action in a way that makes every hit matter. And let's talk about the sound design, because it's honestly next level. The contrast between lighthearted everyday moments and brutal fight sequences make the violence hit way harder. 1 second, everything is fine, and then the next you hear that sickening crunch of bones, and suddenly it's real. That's why the show's most shocking moments stick with you. There's no pulling punches, literally or figuratively. So yeah, sometimes the animation isn't the smoothest, and sure, there are fight scenes that could use a little more polish, but in the grand scheme of things, it works. The story, the characters, the emotion, that's what makes Invincible so damn good. And even with its flaws, it still delivers some of the most intense, unforgettable moments in animation today. Another great thing about Invincible is how it keeps you locked in right up until the very last second of every episode. There's never a moment where you're checking the time or waiting for things to wrap up. If anything, you're hoping it isn't almost over. It uses every bit of its runtime and still somehow ends on a cliffhanger, but it's not the cheap kind either. These cliffhangers aren't just there to shock us, they matter. Just think about the end of season 1. Omni-Man flies off, Mark is completely wrecked, physically and emotionally. No closure, no sense of relief, just 2 annoying ass years of waiting and wondering what the hell happens next. Then season 2 comes along and makes it even worse, introducing threats that make Omni-Man look like a bit of a warm-up, and every time a season ends actually, there's that, for me at least, there's that split second of relief before the realization sets in that Mark's still got a long way to go before he's anywhere near ready for someone like Anissa, let alone Thrag. Plenty of shows rely on cliffhangers as a cheap trick to keep people watching, but Invincible doesn't use them as a crutch. It uses them to build momentum. It never lets us get comfortable because this world doesn't slow down, especially not for Mark. The guy barely gets a second to breathe before life punches him in the face again, which, if we're being honest, makes us a little sadistic for looking forward to it so much. So we've talked a lot about Mark, Debbie, and Omni-Man, but the side characters also deserve just as much credit for making this show what it is. Take Titan. He starts off as a low-level criminal, but before long he's running the city's underworld, justifying it as a necessary evil. or Robot, whose arc forces us to question the line between good intentions and control. What makes these characters so compelling is that Invincible doesn't deal in simple heroes and villains. The show thrives in the gray areas, where survival often means making compromises. That complexity affects the pacing too. A power struggle between Titan and his rivals, or Robot wrestling with his identity, might not have the spectacle of a full-scale battle, but it carries its own kind of tension. Not every threat is a world-ending event. Sometimes the quieter betrayals and shifting allegiances hit just as hard. By weaving these arcs into the main story, Invincible avoids the typical hero fights bad guy, problem solved formula. Instead, it keeps pulling back the curtain, showing us that this world is way more complicated than just who can punch the hardest. And if you're watching this video, you've probably seen plenty of other superhero shows, Young Justice, The Boys, and the endless Marvel and DC animated shows. But Invincible does something different. It fully commits to showing the consequences of being a hero. Young Justice has its heavy moments, but it still follows a more traditional superhero framework. The Boys takes the complete opposite approach, but leaning hard into cynicism and satire. Invincible finds a middle ground. At its core, it's a classic superhero story. Mark genuinely wants to be a hero, to do the right thing, but the show never pretends that's an easy road. The violence isn't just there for the sake of being there. It's a reminder that superpowers don't make you invincible from pain, loss, or failure. At this point, we're all in. There's no question about that. The real question is, how long can Invincible keep this up? If you've read the comics, you know there's still a lot of shit coming our way. We're talking intergalactic wars, deeper dives into Viltrumite society, shifting alliances, betrayals, and sexual assaults. So there's no shortage of material. The real challenge is keeping the twists fresh. We already expect the show to pull the rug out from under us, so season 4 and beyond will have to keep finding new ways to hit us where it hurts. But given how well the show has balanced humor, horror, and heartbreak so far, it's kind of hard to imagine that they're gonna drop the ball now. Either way, we all know the deal. The second a new episode drops, we're clearing our schedules. The question isn't whether Invincible will keep us hooked, it's how many times it's going to emotionally wreck us before the season's done. If there's one thing Invincible does better than most, it's sticking with you long after you've finished an episode. Why do you think I'm making this video? Yeah, the brutal fights, the shock factor, and the over-the-top gore are part of the appeal, but what really keeps us coming back is the emotional weight behind it all. The betrayals, the quiet, heartbreaking moments, the gut punches that have nothing to do with fists. We've watched Mark go from a hopeful kid just trying to figure out his powers to someone who's been through hell but refuses to break. We've seen Debbie pick up the pieces after Nolan's betrayal, trying to hold it together for herself and for Mark. And Eve, she's realizing that being a hero isn't just about fighting villains, it's about actually helping people. And sure, the show leans into its violence. Limbs flying, cities crumbling, genocide, the whole lot. But it never feels like destruction for the sake of it. Everything comes with a cost. Now, I'm curious to hear from you guys, because I'm sure as shit tired of talking. So what's been your favorite tonal shift in the show? Which moment caught you the most off guard? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and if you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this. As always, thank you all so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and until next time, take care.